I'm going to be presenting some research that I did previously in my own classroom. It's science related. It's basically scientific argumentation, and although the original point and title of my research was not necessarily to look at critical thinking and metacognitive awareness, after doing research, analyzing the data, and basically presenting it to some colleagues, it basically came across as this is basically exactly what we were teaching. Although we were teaching science content, we were teaching argumentation, but at the same time, they were really critically assessing what they were reading, how they were reading it, and at the same time, continually monitoring themselves for their own comprehension and their own thinking. So it came out that this was the best result that I found, but there were plenty of other results that I'll kind of talk about. I am currently I teach 10th grade English at Blackman High School. I spent about 5 years teaching middle school social studies. Spent about 5 years, four or 5 years teaching middle school and high school science. At a semester in math in middle school and a year in English in middle school. And hopefully that's not because I'm very poor at all those positions and they keep moving me. Hopefully I'm kind of good at what I do, so they move me around. But I've been in a lot of content areas, and so I was very happy to be able to take this that I did specifically in a science course with scientific argumentation, and then over the years after that kind of broaden it out into other science courses, into social studies and history courses, and then also currently working with 10th grade English students too, because they have to take a test that basically tests on argumentation. So I've kind of branched out with all these things, and so I was really happy to be able to do that. Okay, so why argumentation? Several years ago, I really, it's not that I hadn't heard of argumentation, but I had not been taught argumentation. We were always taught persuasive essays, which I feel like are significantly different than the way I teach argumentation and the way that we approach argumentation, because we kind of try and take the emotional parts out of it. But it's important, especially in the sciences, it's important to do. You can sit there and talk at students all day long and they're not getting anything. But so I always thought it was important for them to do. So if you're going to learn science, you have to do science. Science is about doing. Science is about creating knowledge. That's what we do in science. We read, we have background information, we do things, and we create knowledge. So I always thought it was really important for the students to do that. I find also in English language arts, it's the same thing. If you want a student to be able to read, they have to read. If you want them to write, they have to write. If you want them to write, they have to read. So a lot of doing. Social studies, taught social studies. And it can be so boring if you're just listening to a lecture. If you're not really interested in it, it's really boring. But if we look at some pieces of history, some primary text, and kind of create our own knowledge, our own understandings, it's great. And so I like to do. And so I think teaching by doing and learning by doing is probably the most important thing that drew me to this kind of form of argumentation, the scientific argumentation. And so they need to understand that in content, and it's part of the next generation science standards, so that was important to me as well. At the time, we just all knew that sooner or later we were all going to be doing the next generation science standards, and you had to be able to do this, and it was great. And so I was really psyched about that. And argumentation appears in Common Core standards, it appears in the next generation science standards. So it was really important for me to get a hold of this and get in there. So my questions as I approached my research, and I did this in my own class, I don't know if I mentioned that, but I did this in my own classroom. And so every student I taught that year received this intervention over a 5-week period during an electricity and magnetism unit. And so along the lines of trying to find that perfect spot to do that research, we always thought that this unit was a little too long, and the students came to us with a little bit of background knowledge because you've heard of electricity and magnetism. So they've heard of it, they know a little bit about it. So they come to us with a little bit of background knowledge, and it was a little bit of a lengthy unit. We always thought, my colleagues and I, and so I was like, this is perfect. So that's the unit that I decided to implement this in. And my research questions were looking at the overall effect of argument as far as being taught explicitly. When I was doing my background research, you had studies that showed explicit teaching, you had studies that showed kind of teaching in context by doing, and so I was like, they get really mediocre results in both places, so I thought, well, why not, I want the best results for my kids, so I combine those together. And so we're gonna teach explicitly, and then we're gonna learn also by doing argumentation. what's the overall effect on content knowledge? Because that's obviously really important if we're teaching. I'm not just teaching argumentation, I'm teaching a science class, I'm teaching whatever class. So the development of that content knowledge was extremely important to me as well. And the ability to use that content knowledge in new and innovative situations to solve problems. I think that's probably the most important thing. And so those are the research questions that I approached this with. And so, I'm sorry you can't see the left-hand side of that, but start with basics. In most of the research, they use the Toolman's argument structure. And so you have your claim, you have your data and your evidence. I have Warrenton back in here in red because a lot of the researchers that I read kind of collapse those two into one topic. They call it reasoning, and so we probably hear that a lot lately. See, claims, evidence, reasoning. It's really kind of blowing up, which is great. It makes me so happy that that's happening. So they kind of collapse these into that one category of, what's your reasoning? Explain your data. How's it lead to your claim? And also keep in mind, it has to be legitimate. Why is this evidence legitimate? Why is this source legitimate? And then qualifiers, which I did not use in my teaching and in my interventions. I didn't use the qualifiers because they didn't seem to fit with what we were working on at the time. And so the theory behind this, you have your doing. What am I doing? My God, see the scaffolds I provided. The handouts there that I gave you are the scaffolds that I use. Those aren't the precise scaffolds that I use because obviously over the last experiences I've had since then, I have modified them so that they work better for me. A little Piaget with your background knowledge and your schema that you're forming as you progress through, and then Toolman with the argument structure, and Douglas Walton and his book, or several books and papers on the basic reasoning patterns and how you can support what you say with these basic kind of patterns that the students would use. Okay, I approached this with, it's argumentation is a reasoning tool, it's a pedagogical tool you're going to teach with it, and most of all, the most pleasing to me was as a critical thinking tool. And so we're doing explicit teaching in argumentation, and we're also practicing argumentation as we work. And so I taught them how to argue, how to create an argument, gave them the scaffolds, and then I kind of was like, go forth. And we worked our way through this unit through a vast failure on our first argument because they had never done it before, and then moved progressively to what I thought was extreme success. So I was really pleased, even though they were my kids and it's my classroom, and so, I'm a little biased, but I think the numbers support basically what I'm saying. So I taught, like I said, I taught in context, I taught explicit, and so we kind of started off the unit with this is argument. Hey, we're doing argument, it's great. And they're like, this is nothing but science. And so we created an argument as I was teaching them explicitly the different pieces of argument. We created an argument about cheerleaders, about is cheerleading a sport, and that's what they chose. It was either that or we did iPhone versus Android. So I was trying to find something that was in their wheelhouse, something that they could get, a little bit excited about. Call it a socio-scientific topic because it's sort of scientific, but at the same time, it's also, something that everybody can kind of talk about. So we created this great, fabulous argument together on cheerleading, which I was not really interested in. So fortunately, there were some cheerleaders in the classroom that they argued well for their inclusion of cheerleading as a sport. And so we went through the pieces, and they got it, right off the bat. It was great. We're going to do this. Okay, what's this? We're going to do this. We had our evidence. We had our reasoning. We connected it. We created a counter argument. We created rebuttals. And so the first time I was like, this is great. And then we went to the computer lab, and I'm like, we're learning about electricity, so we're going to learn about AC/DC power, and we're going to look at the debate between Edison and Tesla. And I gave them wonderful websites, and I gave them this argument scaffold. I just go at it and just figure out what they were arguing. And it was horrifying what they put down on paper. They literally had no idea what they were talking about. And I was like, okay, that's fine. It's not a big deal. We'll back up a little bit, and we did some more argument training. So I'm basically teaching argument explicitly, and at the same time, we're looking at arguments in other people's writings and other people's science at the time before we got to the point where the students were creating their own arguments about what they thought. So we were getting there. So this is my data collection. This is what we did. We obviously have a pre and post test. This is a kind of a mixed methods. Quantitative is not my thing, but I did it because I felt like it would lend a little more credence to the fact that, hey, I know this is in my own classroom, so let's make sure there's some numbers there that at least support what I'm saying. And so I did a pre and post test, quantitative, and then there's a way to, I set standards 1, 2, 3, and 4 for the amount of content knowledge they included in arguments and the basic level of argument that they created. So I can analyze that quantitatively as well. I analyzed qualitatively their actual arguments, and then at the end there was kind of an interview. It was a written interview. I didn't actually interview the students because they were my own students, and they probably would have thought it was really weird to sit down one-on-one with me and talk about, so how do you feel about your experience? And so we didn't do that. I gave them questions. They typed it up. It was great. It's so much easier to analyze that way anyway. So I had all that, and then, so this is the quantitative, the numeric scores for the pre and post test, the numeric scores from the argument quality, the numeric scores from the written discourse. Here with their argument patterns or reasoning was a kind of an iterative analysis, and then with their interviews, I kind of tried to do a grounded theory-based analysis where I pulled the analysis out of their words precisely. I didn't want to interject myself at all there, and so that's what the kind of analysis. Some of my colleagues told me I was being very ambitious with this, and they were absolutely accurate. I think it took me, I can't even imagine the hours to sift through all this and analyze it and write it all up. But so here's what I was speaking about with the numeric scores assigned to their arguments. So if you had no electricity or magnetism knowledge in your argument, then you got a 1. If you had incorrect knowledge, you got a 2. I thought I was being really nice there. At least they tried. They put some knowledge in there. There was data. It was incorrect data, but there was data. If it was non-specific, it was just general knowledge, then I gave them a 3. And if they were specific and they were accurate in what they were saying in their argument, then they rated a 4. As far as their skill in argument and the numerical values there. Okay, if you have a claim, you're good. If you have a claim with data, you're better. If you have a claim with data and reasoning, you're so very close to where we want you to be, but that's where I wanted to be, was a little bit farther, but currently claims, evidence, reasoning is significant as what we're teaching. And then if you could come up with, a little bit of counter argument, that was great. If you could see the other side, that's perfect. That's kind of what critical thinking is about. That's what I want you to do. And then all the literature said this is the most difficult part right here. Claims, evidence, reasoning, we can get them there. Counter argument, rebuttal, they're zoned in. Once they come up with what they want, they know exactly what they want to write, and that's great. And then seeing the other side is not going to happen. And so this is the most difficult part right here. And so in order to do this, I grouped them oppositionally, and it kind of helped a little bit there. I think I have a slide on that. Okay, so I thought I had a slide on that. But so this is the quantitative analysis. It doesn't, the main thing that I liked was they came into it with some knowledge here, about 50% on the test. And this was not a test created by me. This was a test that we had used standard in science in the electricity magnetism unit the whole time that I've been teaching it. So I didn't create the test. It was there when I got there. I'm sure it's there right now. But so I gave them that as the pre-test. I gave them that as the post-test. And the great results that I like is, yeah, they came with some background knowledge. And I knew that. I knew that's what they had entered with. But my mean score on that test at the end of there was almost a 97. It's over the years. This was the last year I taught this course, and the years leading up to that, this is just ridiculous results that I got in a regular classroom. So I was really happy about that. The argument, they didn't know anything about argument when they started, and quite frankly, specifically, they didn't know as much about argument as in, I can bubble in things on a test, but they could create some arguments, and that's, to me, far better than bubbling in on a test. Argument quality went up. There were several different arguments. We started off with the DC, AC versus DC, then we moved on to series and parallel wiring, and then we moved on to our culmination, which was they were researching high voltage power lines. And I figured for school students, that's very, it's in their world, because schools are often built near high voltage power lines. So the land is cheap. Schools, often like to buy cheap land. And so this was something that really affected them. And they really got into this. And this was really high-level stuff. High-level stuff that I had to, do a little intensive research before I got in there and taught them, for fear that they would ask me a question that I could not answer. And so it was some high-level stuff, especially for, these are 13, 14-year-old kids. And so they really took to that. And as they developed, you can see from, I analyzed it from AC/DC to series and parallel, and then from series and parallel to the power lines, and then from the AC/DC all the way to the power lines to see their level of improvement. We have statistical significant improvement from each level, but extremely high improvement from the AC/DC argument, where the average score was a 1.8, so they averaged no argument at all, or no knowledge at all, to incorrect knowledge, and they moved all the way up to obviously having appropriate and then very good knowledge. Well, flip that. This is the knowledge. And then their arguments, once again, significantly improving to the point where they started off with very poor arguments and ended up with very high quality arguments at the end. This is kind of the analysis of their arguments and what they're including as they are presenting these arguments to me. And I'm not going to get into what they said, but what I want to point out is that you have this wide range of things here in their first argument. They're saying a ton of things. They're saying a ton of things. And a lot of them are saying the same thing, some places, but then there's a few people that are getting other things in there. And then as we progress to the next argument, you're getting less of a broad spectrum. You're getting more kind of zoned in there. They're getting the things that they're supposed to be getting, and everybody's kind of getting what they're supposed to be getting, and there's not as much extraneous activity going on. And then when you get, we also did something on gas station fires with the Mythbusters and such. It was much more easy, so you see there's not as much variance. They were definitely on there. And then when you get to the final one, you got all these, everybody's basically, yeah, they're there, they're on the same page, they're reading the same things, they're reading them critically, they're monitoring their own learning, and they're getting the right ideas. And then, they're children, you're gonna have outliers always. But as they developed, it was far less scattered to a much more, we're reading what we're reading, we're getting what everybody's getting about the same thing from it. We're all using a methodology that works, and it's that argumentation. It's the scaffolds that I provided. They're looking specifically. They're asking themselves questions. What am I looking for here specifically? How am I going to find it? Why is it legitimate? So the scaffolds help them to critically assess what they're reading with purpose and with the bias and motivations, all of those things in mind as they read it. The students were definitely able to do that far more specifically as they moved on. And then we analyze student perceptions, like I said, and there's, it's all over the board. Claims really important. Counter arguments is important, but they definitely said the paired groupings. They allow for more opinions, better comments as they're commenting on their peers' papers and saying, well, did you think about this? And did you think about that? And that's the greatest thing. That's that counter-argument rebuttal piece. When I had them paired, and then, we did an online commentary where they posted their argument, and then other people would comment on it and say, did you think, just showing them the other point of view, helping every time they experience that other point of view, then that allows them to use that background knowledge, use that experience the next time they see something, they're like, okay, maybe I should think about the other side. And so I really enjoyed that. And so my results, as I talked about while I was going through there, we had statistically significant improvement in basically all aspects across the board as we went through, as I figured we would, because I was basically trying everything that people had said sort of worked and put it all together in something that I figured would absolutely. And so that's, clear improvement, extensive mastery of content. Almost everybody got well over 90% on their test. Tons of people got hundreds. It's results I'd never seen in the classroom before. I had the gifted teacher next door to me was like, are you kidding me? So literally, I got everything out of it I wanted to get out. Limitations, very small sample size. It's just my classroom. I implemented the intervention with all my students, but I only chose one class to research on, and then only a certain amount of them returned the papers, and then some students moved, and so I end up with like a 16 student sample size, which is really, really small, and I get that. But across all my classes, even though I don't have papers, I don't have the data here, I can tell you that the results were the same across all 130-something kids that I taught that year. And then Also, data that I don't have here, at the end of the year, that year we implemented an end of course test for, these were 8th grade students trying to get trying to get high school credit for taking this class in the 8th grade, and at the end of the year, we had a 92% pass rate on that end of course test. So I felt like, although I didn't have any previous data to compare it to, I felt like that was just pretty darn good. And so I guess that's about it. Fabulous. Questions? Yes.
Did you feel like the kids going deeper than necessary was part of the key?
I felt like the kids understand, when they got to the point where they had to defend themselves to other students, that was the key, because they don't like being wrong. And so they really excessively provided evidence to keep from being wrong. And so I felt like, in fact, that was, I didn't point it out, but in the grounded theory analysis of their comments, that was huge. I don't like being wrong, and I like being right. I don't want anyone to tell me that I'm wrong, so I'm going to make sure that I'm completely right. And so I felt like that was, depth is always great. I felt like in education for so many years we've gone really wide and really shallow, and then with a couple of signatures on some legislation, now suddenly we're going really, really deep. But at the same time, I don't think they've narrowed it enough for us to go really deep, because we're still trying to do all this and go really, really deep. But the fact that they did dig deeper, I think, affects their overall comprehension. If you're continuing to work with the same subject matter, only deeper and deeper, then absolutely you're going to get a more significant understanding. Yes.
Do you think it's possible to do this several times a year with several units, or do you think it's something that
Absolutely.
you have to back off of?
I love it. I use it consistently. This was done with middle school students. A couple of years later after this, I moved up to the high school in the same district. So basically the same kids, and these are I think 68 to 72% free and reduced lunch kids, Title I school. And I used it with consistency. I tried to do it once in every unit, at least do an argument. Now with the high school students, they didn't need as much of that training. I still gave them the scaffolds, I still talked to them, I was always there. I was just wandering around, helping everybody all the time. But they didn't need as much training, so I felt like I could literally do this at least once a unit. We're doing some sort of argument, whether you're writing a paper or whether we're doing something in class, but I did try to implement it as often as possible. Now, is it possible to teach your entire class using, through argumentation? I don't think so. I think that would be too much. You can't teach all the content, because there has to be some background before you can get there. Scientists don't start off doing science at 5 years old, 6 years old, 10 years old, right? They're reading, they're seeing what other people have done, and then they get to the point where they're, doing science and creating their own knowledge. But first you have to kind of see what everybody else is doing. And so a good mix, I think, is absolutely necessary. Yes, ma'am.
When did you do that?
About 2 years ago.
Okay, so were you able to look at the transfer to any of the standardized measures that we have to take in science for the district?
Well, that year we took that end of course. That was the only test that they took that year, and so they scored extremely well. 85% of the student body in that whole grade level took the test, and like I said, my class had a 92% pass rate for those kids, which those are the scores that actually got me the job at the high school. So, but I did, fortunately, since I was in the same district, when I moved up to the high school, a ton of those kids that I had taught, I saw again. I began teaching a research elective at that high school, and over half the kids in that one class that I did the project in, over half those kids immediately signed up for my research class. They get in there and they basically just picked up where they left off, except for a few outliers, but they basically just picked up where they left off, and they were zooming, we would take votes as what we were gonna research, and they would just go. I was basically kind of wandering around with my hands in my pockets, need again? Need again? They really did. Those kids, not only did they kind of get the science and they get that methodology, but they kept it going, and they transferred 2 years later into high school. So I was pretty pleased with that.
So McNeil has been a big proponent of the claims evidence reasoning framework, and she's published a lot for elementary and middle school. Do you think sounds like they didn't know a lot about CER.
They didn't know what I was talking
So
about.
that's not being implemented.
And it was, well, where I came from, it was nowhere. Not in any sciences, not in anything was I seeing that. And really, like, when I went to my principal, he was like, what is this? And so I don't believe there was any overlap because they were completely clueless. Like, the first arguments, when they were just trying to identify the parts in someone else's argument, it was horrifying what they put there. They really had no idea what they were writing down on the paper. And so they weren't thinking critically, they weren't analyzing what they were reading. Nothing that they were doing at the end were they doing at the beginning. There's always a couple of kids that are just good. They're just good at these sorts of things. And there were a couple of those, but they really kept it to themselves. They were not helping me out at all by being peer helpers. They kind of kept it. I didn't even know until I read it. I'm like, you didn't say anything. You could have said, hey, I think I know what's going on. No, they did not. But I definitely